So we're actually going to have two panels about the future of college admissions and affirmative action. In the first panel, we're going to be talking about the broader issues facing admissions, and then we'll focus a little bit more on affirmative action, and particularly the lawsuits against Harvard and UNC in the second panel. Like earlier, you can use Slido on your phones or tablets to ask questions. And we're also going to do a poll question, which is up on your screen right now. Do you support the use of affirmative action in college admissions? So if you want to answer that question. It looks like we have almost 100% support, which will make our second panel incredibly interesting, given we have the lawyer for the plaintiff here today. So almost overwhelming support for affirmative action in admissions. I've been inside the admissions process for the last year at 3 universities as part of a book that I'm working on around the future of college admissions that Simon & Schuster is going to publish next year. And I think one of the things that's often lost in the debate over admissions is that the average acceptance rate at US colleges is 65%. 65%. So for all those stories we hear about all the time about how hard it is to get into college today, the average acceptance rate is 65%. Only 13% of four-year colleges in the US accept fewer than half of their applicants, 13% of four-year colleges in the US. So in many ways, it's actually fairly easy, or easier than we think, I think, to get into college. Yet it's the colleges and universities, a handful of them that where the applications are plenty and the seats are scarce, that tend to scare up, I think, most of the news coverage about college admissions and our emotions. And so, Tony, I want to ask you, given your work in this area, why are we so obsessed as a country with the most selective institutions in this country?
Great question. Minority position doesn't equal minority status. Mm-hmm. So the way in which the elite colleges, especially those who are most selective, have that kind of social weight needs to be taken into consideration, right? There's a reason why certain schools are that have that kind of power, but you also can't deny the way in which social class and inequality shapes our perception of what college needs to be. You know, I tell this joke, I said when I was growing up, there were only 3 Ivy League schools, Harvard, Yale, and Princeton, and the only reason why Princeton made the list was because of the Fresh Prince of Bel-Air, right? So the image of college and the image of selectivity are like what gets perpetuated through not just the movies that we watch and the news cycles that some of us who pay attention to it know, is that those schools have a certain power and a certain long history of shaping the narrative of higher education, not just for people who are in the know, who understand colleges, but for what everyday people get to have an understanding of. And so that actually needs to be part of the conversation. But these colleges have an outsized effect, both on the college workings. Think about it. When one of those schools announces a certain financial aid policy change, like Princeton in 1998 with no loan financial aid, or when Harvard did the hiring freeze during the financial crisis of 2008, other schools followed.
And right? So does that mean they also have, because they have an outsized effect, does that also mean they have an outsized responsibility?
Yes, I think they do. Okay. But also, like, we have to realize that a lot of schools follow what they do, and that actually just amplifies their message and amplifies their role within society, but also the system of higher education more generally.
Barry, you work with students and parents a lot who are applying to college, and you've been on both sides of this system. Do you encourage students and parents to think more broadly than these most selective colleges and universities, and what happens when you do that?
Sure, I actually beg. For me, it's very much, and the whole reason I'm a college counselor is because somebody helped me find the right fit for myself, and it was life-changing. Education was transformative. My parents didn't go to college. They didn't ask me. They didn't expect me to go. But I found a place that I really felt when I found it was built for me. I'd never heard of it before when my counselor said it to me. I try to do the same for my students. It's really not about the name on the gates. It's about what you can do if you can thrive once you're there. And I think there are so many students who have found themselves in a place for sometimes the wrong reasons and realize that after the fact. And some of them are my own students where families push back against my best advice and then they weren't able to make it. So I really try very hard for students to look at fit, to see where will I thrive? Where's the best place for me? Academically, what's the sort of the vibe and the tension? People-wise, where are my people? These are such important things. The social piece for me more than the academic. You can really get a good education, a great education, really just about anywhere, and students will be challenged anywhere. College calculus is just hard, no matter where you take it. And so, there's this perception also of kind of needing to climb your way up, and like somehow that feels good necessarily all the time. So students can land in places that actually are counterproductive to their goals.
Is part of the problem that we think that opportunity is scarce now, given what's happening to the economy and the broader global economy, and so they think, a degree from a selective institution is kind of insurance against that? Is that what you're hearing?
I mean, I think a little bit, but I think so much of it is just status in our culture that's obsessed with all of this nonsense. Is it really all that surprising with how obsessed we are with celebrity culture, and all we want is what we can't have? And it's like the lower the admit rate, the more everybody wants to go. And it's like this race to zero.
So it's about that sticker on the back of the card.
It really is, I think. I think it's fair. It's more complex than that, but I think at the core, there's a lot of that, a lot of cultural and social stuff going on.
So Tony, I'd like to remind the students and parents that I'm talking to for my book that admissions is really not about them, it's about the college, right? It's about the goals of the college that differs from institution to institution and could even differ from year to year, right? Colleges want geographic diversity, they need some full payers in some cases, they at least have to pay attention to ability to pay in other cases, they might need certain majors and things like that. In your opinion, what do you think should be the top admissions goal for a selective institution? You've written about this idea of economic affirmative action. Should that be the top goal? And maybe you could explain to the audience about what you mean by economic affirmative action. I
mean, for me, it's hard to say what the top goal should be because, quite frankly, my work and what my push is we need to think beyond who gets in. We need to think beyond access and talk about what happens, those overlooked moments between convocation and commencement. So much of our attention has been on the admit rates and the graduation rates and who goes to Goldman versus who goes to TFA that we forget about those 4 years that matter the most if a college serves as a mobility springboard, the 4 years between convocation and commencement determines how big of a mobility jump it can actually be. Right, and so for me to say, what should the admissions office determine as their number one thing? Sure, I want a more diverse class. Sure, I want people from more states. I want people from different perspectives, those for whom college is new and old. I want that kind of mix because students will never experience as much diversity as they do in their freshman seminar for the rest of their life. But also at the same time, if we stop the conversation there, we're going to be hurting generations of students even more than we've done before.
In other words, once they get on campus, you have to provide kind of that social capital that particularly first generation students need that they're not necessarily coming into college with. Is that what you mean by that?
Yeah, it's a host of things. The fact that we focus so much on access, we have all these policies that really trip students up. For example, I always tell when I go to a school, we always say when office hours are, right? We always go to a class, say my office hours are 2 to 4. When has a professor ever defined office hours and said what they are used for or what can be done in those particular moments? We have this assumption that everyone understands how college should work and how to navigate. They know this, they have this cultural landscape or this insider knowledge, right? But we pat ourselves on the back 20% of our students are first gen, 35% of our students are on financial aid for more than 75% of their tuition. But what does that mean when you come from a high school where teachers are not allowed because of resources, time, and energies, where they spent more time maintaining order than making connections, but you're supposed to enter a school and sit around a table with 5 other people and have a conversation about something and then go to office hours and then be invited to coffee and you don't know that the professor is paying, so you say no to making those moments? But who gets those letters of recommendation?
Right.
Who gets the internships? Who gets the emotional support? When you have to be proactive in forging those relationships, but we just focus on who gets in, don't care as much about what happens when they do, and then we wonder why all of our Rhodes nominees come from private schools and top 1% families.
Right. Barry, great point. It's because it's really about how you go to college, not where you go to college. The top institutions are kind of havens these days for wealth. We know that from so many of the studies that have been out there, and every year they continue to reject thousands of students, and the number of denies at these colleges are growing. In many ways, that seems to be encouraging those who have the financial means to hire more people like you, right? To hire more private counselors, and that just actually kind of widens that divide even more for those students who have the access to know what to do to get into college. Do you think that there needs to be? I'm not suggesting that Rick Singer he started out as a private counselor. I'm not saying that there are a lot of private counselors like him in your field, but it seems like there's very few standards among independent counselors. Do you think that there needs to be more, especially in light of the Varsity Blues scandal?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this is something that I talk about with my colleagues quite a bit. There's really no barrier to entry in my profession, and that's a problem. But there are organizations, actually, Rick Singer was not in any of them, not surprisingly, that hold consultants to a high level of ethical standard and require continuing education and ongoing learning and proof of professional development. The Independent Educational Consultants Association, IECA, Higher Education Consultant Association, HECA, both places. There's also an association of independent AICEP, and it's basically Certified Educational Planners, American Association of Certified Educational Planners, which is a mountain of requirements to qualify for that. So there are things out there for the public to kind of gauge, are these honest players or not? In every profession, there are bad apples. Rick Singer was one of them. We didn't see anybody on the admissions side implicated.
But yet the people who tend to use, a lot of the people I'm meeting who tend to use independent counselors already come from great high schools with great counselors, right? So it's just like giving them kind of a double advantage.
Yeah.
Why does this sector
Absolutely.
even exist?
So I think that there's a couple of things. One is that you can go to a private school, you can go to a fancy school, and by the way, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're getting as individualized attention as you would want. You are getting more individualized attention than where I went to high school, where 880 people graduated in the class, and there were one or two people helping all of us. There are some people who want more one-on-one help. They are able to access it. I work with students in CBOs who receive services for free.
Community-based organizations.
Community-based organizations, all Pell Grant recipients, first in their family to go to college, trying to get the services out to everybody. I think it's complicated. I think in terms of one thing that I've learned is that when I'm sitting across from a 17-year-old, they're pretty not knowledgeable.
Right.
And they need help and guidance, and they do deserve that. I'm not saying it's fair and equitable across. I do try to do my part in getting into CBOs and working with students, but 17-year-olds in general need guidance and help in this process. And
even when you provide the guidance, they don't necessarily listen.
They don't always listen. This is true.
We're going to be having a couple of minutes here. We're going to be going to questions from the audience, so please join in there at slido.com. You both have talked about equity. The next panel, we're going to be talking specifically about affirmative action in the case against Harvard in particular. There's a very good chance that case may go to the Supreme Court eventually. There's speculation that, given the current makeup of the court, that affirmative action in college admissions could be struck down. What will our colleges look like, and how will they be able to enroll a diverse class if they cannot consider race in admissions? Tony, I'll start with you. I'll ask this question of both of you.
I don't even know what to say. To be 100% honest with you, the fact that, this backdoor way of taking down affirmative action by pitting racial groups against each other and homogenizing racial groups, it's just, sometimes I wish we did what was morally right and not just was legally defensible in this country when it comes to certain things. And so I don't know what it's going to look like. We have a sense about what happened in California. I believe that Schools are going to get whiter, richer, with a disproportionately high number of Asian American students, especially if we only use SAT scores, different things. I mean, we see this what's happening in New York with their exam schools. We saw what happened in other places. It's going to be very interesting. I don't think first generation college student status alone is going to be enough, because thinking about the numbers of how many first-gen students are white in America versus other racial groups, we will still have a disproportionate number. It's going to be very hard to create a diverse class if this goes to Supreme Court and it gets struck down.
Okay. Barry, same question for you, and then we're going to move to some questions from the audience.
I mean, I don't know exactly, but one thing that I do know is that when you look at cases like New York, when you look at cases like New Orleans, that going to this sort of lottery, or just purely numbers-based system, it actually doesn't do anything good for the system itself. We see even increased segregation. We see things getting worse, not better. So I'm concerned that that might be the case. And I'm not sure.
So we have some questions from the audience here. Is it better for African American students to go to an HBCU or an Ivy League college? Tony. I'm asking you.
No, I know.
Go to an HBCU, so.
Yeah, and I went to Amherst, so and now teach at Harvard. The question is not either. It's not an either or. A student of any race, but especially African American, should go to a school that is the most supportive for them. If we're talking about how social class works, and I specifically focus on lower income and first generation college students, we have to think about the schools that have who graduates more students, who gives them different kind of opportunities to do so. So I always tell students to go to the best school that gives you the most money, that gives you the most opportunity. We also have to realize that not all skin folk are kinfolk. And so if we actually think that just going to an HBCU or just going to a Hispanic serving institution is enough, that's looking at it in a very, very simplistic way. Too simplistic to actually give advice, just because you're black, you should go to HBCU. This kind of segregation in higher education is not necessarily what we should be reproducing. Because if a student told me that they had a choice between going to like Brown or Spelman, that's a very interesting conversation. I would say damn near flip a coin. But if a student had a choice between going to the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee and Dartmouth, that's a very different kind of conversation to be had. I want the students to be matched. I'm not trying to enforce undermatching. I'm not trying to enforce a kind of segregation in higher education. I want the student to go to a place that gives them the best opportunities.
And when you say match, you don't just mean academic match, you mean social match, and you also mean financial match.
Yeah.
I think that last piece, sometimes people forget about the financial match of an institution. What colleges and universities are doing a good job supporting first-gen and low-income students? Barry, when you say you work with CBOs, what types of things do you tell the students that and those community-based organizations? What should they be looking for in a college?
Sure. The interesting thing is that while they're not as knowledgeable about some of the basics of the college process, they're very keenly aware of what campuses feel and look like. So they often are actually pretty perceptive. They'll look at schools, Ivy League schools, elite institutions, and they'll say, I don't want to go here, even if they could potentially get in. We've also had students who have wanted very much so to go to an HBCU, but the financial aid has made it absolutely untenable. They can't do it. And so it's actually a real struggle because the financial piece is so important, and it really ends up a lot where they get the most money, unfortunately. Sometimes that's a good thing, and it's the right place also for them, but a lot of times it's really just comes down to dollars and cents.
Because it may not be the best academic or social fit, but it
They got to be able to afford it. They have to be able to afford it. I have a student this year whose mother makes $11,000. The college wanted her mother to take out $17,000 in loans each year. I mean, it's just, from a place that you would never imagine would offer this package.
Right.
Yeah.
Tony.
I just want to add, there are schools that have some good programs, but no one school is doing it right? So when I think about the Georgetown Scholars Program here in DC, that's a program that's doing an amazing job of not only welcoming students during orientation, but helping them get to graduation. But we should also think about like the Meyerhoff Scholars Program at University of Maryland, Baltimore County, programs that are literally changing the demographics of science in this country. So there are models that we have that we can look to, and quite surprising to some people, they're not all at the Ivies, right? And so we need to get away from that image to get to your first question. and think about what are the programs that are working. There are some community colleges in Texas that have increased their graduation rates tremendously. There are some state schools that have amazing programs that are helping students, that are doubling the number of scientists that they produce from the BA level. We need to learn more about what they are doing and seeing how we can adapt it to different colleges. And so that is what I would say, like, oh, not one school is doing it right, but what are the programs that are in place that have helped the target population, and how can we actually be able to expand that across the sector?
We could talk about this subject, I think, all day. We didn't even touch upon some of the other issues in admissions, but unfortunately we've run out of time. So please join me in thanking Barry and Tony.
Thank you.